Ready? The City Commission meeting for June 16, 2020 is called to order. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Chilton.
Here.
Dr. Estra.
Here.
Mr. O'Neill.
Here.
Mr. Rue.
Here.
Mr. Copeland.
Here. Join me in the invocation. Our God, we're grateful for the opportunity to gather to seek to make decisions that are good for the city of Springfield. Help us to do that well today. And we pray for the relationship between our police department and our people. We see difficulties occurring in other cities, and we only pray it doesn't happen here because we believe that our police and our citizens have to have a good spirit with each other. Help us to make good decisions today. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Declaration of Independence. America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of our last meeting?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. O'Neill.
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton.
Yes.
Mr. Rue.
Yes.
Dr. Estra.
Yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes. Clerk will proceed with first readings by title only.
Providing for the issuance and sale of notes in the maximum principal amount of $97,000 in anticipation of the issuance of bonds for the purpose of paying the cost of constructing and equipping improvements at the Springfield-Beckley Municipal Airport, and providing for all related site improvements, including the construction of new hangars and taxi lanes, together with all necessary appurtenances thereto. Authorizing the city manager to enter into a contract with Structural Systems Repair Group, LLC, for the water treatment plant concrete repairs and wastewater treatment plant secondary clarifiers and effluent diversion concrete repair for an amount not to exceed $3,704,415. Authorizing the city manager to enter into a memorandum of understanding with the Board of Clark County Commissioners for communication and dispatch services.
Questions or comments from the commission? Mr. Estroff.
Thank you. Brian, I was wondering if you could go into some detail about ordinance 123-20. I'm pleased to see it on the agenda, but I think it would benefit if we could give the public an explanation about what is occurring.
Yes, I think the best way to explain this is step one of 3 as we work towards the potential merger with the county, specifically the sheriff's office, for dispatch services for Clark County as a whole. I say step 1 of 3, this MOU will allow for the Clark County Sheriff's Office to enter into contract negotiations with their dispatchers. We have laid out in the memorandum of understanding things that we need to have met, specifically in those contract negotiations as it relates to our employees and their fair treatment and being brought over to a combined center that would be operated by the sheriff's office. It also establishes the ability or the creation of an advisory board that has some specific roles and responsibilities laid out in the MOU, but those things would be further clarified as a part of an actual contract. So entering into this MOU, again, just allows the Clark County Sheriff's Office to enter into contract negotiations. They will be required by the MOU to enter into those contract negotiations with their dispatchers no later than September 1st of this year. If after the contract negotiations, which I consider step 2 of 3, are completed and they complete in satisfaction the requirements laid out in this MOU, then the city and the county would work to further develop an actual contract for dispatching and communication services between the city and the county, and that would be step 3 of the process. Again, this would be step 1, which occurs now in the second quarter of 2020. Again, they have to start contract negotiations no later than September 1 of this year. I would envision those would take some time into third and possibly fourth quarter of 2020. And then we would work between the city and county to develop an actual contract for dispatch and communication services that incorporates all the elements that are in the MOU, but will further clarify. In the MOU, it spells out a dispute resolution mechanism if services aren't being provided in a satisfactory manner according to our police and fire divisions. And so it allows us a mechanism to resolve any disputes on the way it's operated. That's not spelled out in that what the actual process is in the MOU. That is something that would be further spelled out and detailed in an actual contract that we would have to enter into them in that third step of the process. So again, this is kind of the start of it to allow them to enter into contract negotiations. That's going to be a key and critical part of this entire discussion is, are they successful in meeting the requirements that we've spelled out in this MOU into their contract with their dispatchers so that our employees receive fair treatment in the merger.
Thank you so much.
Brian, I think it's fair to say that we're picking up kind of where the hiccups took place when we broke away from the table the last time. That we wanted to make sure that our employees were treated as equal as the county employees, because they're going to be one and the same. I also think it's fair to say, at least from my position, I'm willing to continue to talk about this with the county, and this is a good step forward, but I think we have a long way to go and before we would give up our situation. But I'm just glad to see that they have decided to come back to the table. And I'm assuming that they decided to come back to the table because, again, we worked awfully hard on this for several years, and for it to just fall apart, it was a shame that that happened. A lot of good work went for naught. But it's good that we were able to pick up where we left off and see if we can't put something together like this. But again, it's a long way from home, I think.
In my opinion, this is something that will absolutely save the citizens some money and be a safer route. This is something I think that all of us have hopefully wanted to happen, as long as we can dot all the I's in the negotiations. I don't think we're as far away as Commissioner O'Neill makes it sound, because 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you were bridges and states away. I think we're very close, in my opinion, than we've ever been to merge this together. There's just a few steps that are very important, but to me, this is really close, Kevin, as I'm looking at it. But the steps that need to be agreed upon are pretty important. But I don't think we're as long as far away as you're making it sound, in my opinion.
I think you're probably both right. I think we're closer than
That's
we've
impossible.
And I think there's some.
Sorry to hear that, Rob.
Maybe we can work through the issues that are left, but the issues that are left remain very, very important. So,
Right.
And I want to congratulate Brian with staying in there and encourage him to proceed, but protect our interests, because we want this to be an agreement that improves our service, not that hurts our service.
So, Brian,
Yes.
can you back up just for a second and tell how we got to this point?
Yeah, so specifically at the end of October of 2019, we had kind of reached a stalemate between the city and the county in terms of negotiations. A lot of it revolved around the treatment of our employees in the merger, specifically on pay and benefits, and really surrounded one primary classification was our supervisors specifically. The supervisors were not treated fairly. Again, our supervisors are usually our most senior and highly trained individuals in our center, and they were getting a raw deal. And so we broke away from conversations at that point. Another big sticking point was having say in the process and having some say in how dispatch operations were conducted, as well as having a mechanism if things were not being done correctly or in a satisfactory manner, that we had some means to debate those, to go through a dispute resolution. And so, in October, those talks kind of completed. And then in early 2020, we kind of started coming back to the table and having some conversations. Didn't amount to a whole lot because COVID came in March. And so we never really were able to finalize or move forward with anything to take these next steps. But in May, Jenny Hutchinson and I, the county administrator, were able to meet and talk and work through and finally get to the point of drafting this MOU. Much credence to Jill Allen. This is Jill Allen's work in crafting this document to reflect the things that we want to see accomplished or satisfied as part of the next steps of this merger. And so we were able to put that together, and obviously the county has already signed it. And so we bring it to you in these next 2 meetings for your consideration before obviously we would execute it. But I believe the MOU, and to what the mayor's point was, is this MOU lays out that framework. It allows us to start somewhere under a framework. One of the biggest obstacles or hangups has been the negotiations with the separate unions. And until we had a mechanism in place that allowed them or triggered those contract negotiations, we really could only talk about things that we wanted to see happen in those contracts. Now this MOU allows us to actually go through that contract negotiation phase to see if they can actually accomplish and get those things that we need for our employees to be treated fairly.
Thank you, Brian.
Well, I would like to commend all of you who worked on this, everyone who worked on this, and certainly encourage you to continue to work hard and hopefully bring this to fruition. This would be a wonderful step forward for Springfield and Clark County both. So congratulations and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Okay. There's no vote now. Are there any other questions or comments on first readings? Clerk will proceed with second readings.
An ordinance providing for the issuance and sale of notes in the aggregate principal amount of $3,396,360 in anticipation of the issuance of bonds for the purpose of paying the cost of constructing and equipping a new parking garage and improving the site therefore, together with all necessary appurtenances thereto.
So moved. Dave.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or comments from the commission? Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Rue?
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill?
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton?
Yes.
Dr. Estrad?
Yes.
Mr. Copeland?
Yes.
Providing for the issuance of notes in the maximum principal amount of $167,280 in anticipation of the issuance of bonds for the purpose of paying the cost of improving the municipal sewer system, including replacing sanitary sewer lines, together with all necessary appurtenances thereto.
So
Move to
moved.
adopt.
Second.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or comments from the commission? Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Chilton?
Yes.
Mr. Rue?
Yes.
Dr. Estrad?
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill?
Yes.
Mr. Copeland?
Yes.
Providing for the issuance of notes in the maximum principal amount of $402,900 in anticipation of the issuance of bonds for the purpose of paying the cost of improving the municipal water system, including replacing water lines, together with all necessary appurtenances thereto.
Move
So
to
moved.
adopt.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or comments from the commission? Clerk will call the roll.
Dr. Estrad?
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill?
Yes.
Mr. Rue?
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton?
Yes.
Mr. Copeland?
Yes.
Authorizing the city manager to enter into amendment number 1 to the agreement with Wolford Incorporated for master planning services at the Springfield-Beckley Municipal Airport to extend the agreement to December 31, 2020.
So
Move to
moved.
adopt.
Did you get clear on who was moving and seconding there? Okay, are there
Yes.
questions or comments from the commission? We don't have any other viewers, right?
No,
I don't have to ask for the audience. Okay,
no. I received no comments.
clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Chilton,
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Mr. Rue,
Yes.
Dr. Estrop,
Yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes.
Authorizing the city manager to enter into an agreement with Clark State Community College to provide supplemental police services. Authorizing the city manager, director of finance, law director, and chief of police to do all things necessary and execute all documents they deem necessary to implement the said agreement and to comply with all relevant local, state, and federal legal requirements.
Move to
Move.
adopt.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or comments from the commission? Clerk will call the roll.
Dr. Estrop,
Yes.
Mr. Rue,
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton,
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes.
Approving an alternative method of apportionment of the local government fund of Clark County, Ohio.
So moved.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Mr. Estrop.
I was wondering if Brian might explain, if we approve this, what is the impact of this resolution?
So the impact, so back in 1988, the existing formula that is utilized for distribution of funds from the local government fund from the state level was set. At that time, we started receiving 48.18% of the distribution of funds to Clark County. This expires at the end of 2020. And so the county is working on just getting this updated. There are no changes at this point in time proposed for the formula. So we would remain at 48.18%. So that would not change. So it would have no impact on us, which is we're supportive of and agree with.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton,
Yes.
Mr. Rue,
Yes.
Dr. Estrop,
Yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes.
Providing for supplemental appropriations within various funds and declaring an emergency therein.
So moved.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or comments from commission? Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Rue,
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Dr. Estrop,
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton,
Yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes.
Confirming purchases and the obtaining of services for the city and providing for payments therefore and declaring an emergency therein.
So moved.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or comments from the commission? From the audience? Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Chilton,
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Mr. Rue.
Yes.
Dr. Estrop,
Yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes.
Authorizing the city manager to enter into an agreement for property acquisition, maintenance, and disposition of 1822 South Limestone Street with the Clark County Land Reutilization Corporation for an amount not to exceed $90,000. Authorizing the city manager, law director, and the director of finance to perform all acts and execute all documents they consider necessary to fulfill the city's obligations under said agreement and to comply with all relevant local, state, and federal legal requirements and declaring an emergency therein.
So moved.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or comments from the commission? Mr. Estrop.
Is this the property adjacent to the Kroger store?
No, this is actually the Kroger store itself.
Okay.
It's the agreement that we would have in place with the land bank to be able to assume title to that property from Kroger. as we work to come up and work towards a redevelopment plan of that property and that building.
So this is our contribution to acquisition of and maintenance of that property,
Not to acquisition, but to operation and maintenance of that.
operation and maintenance.
Is donating the
Right.
property.
The
Right.
property is basically
to the
free.
land bank. Yep.
So the acquisition cost is
committed to-
zero, but the maintenance is ongoing, obviously, once we and the county take possession of it.
Yes, and specifically, we did not, working with our partners at the land bank, we did not want to put them in a position where they were outlaying costs for something that they don't have money for. And so this is our contribution to the project to keep this moving forward, because again, at the end of the day, we want to find solutions for the South Limestone Corridor and for the community with that property. And again, we're fortunate that we got to the point of Kroger donating the property to the community without deed restrictions to allow us as a community to work towards redeveloping the property. And this is that vehicle that will allow us to really start moving that process and advancing that process forward.
We are continuing discussions with interested parties, are we not?
Yes, that is correct. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to bring some good news, positive news about that here in the near future as well.
Great. Thank you very much.
So Brian, since this is the Kroger actual building, I get asked in the community oftentimes, do we have a end game as far as how long is the land bank going to hold that property? How long is the city going to allow that? And what's the end game here?
Yeah, so the agreement itself with the county has an initial 6-month term. There is the ability to extend that by 3 months. I would foresee that really in these next 90 days after title's taken, we're going to hopefully have that end game, that plan moving forward for redevelopment. I think the building itself can be an asset and can be utilized in the future, but we're going to evaluate that. We're going to continue to evaluate that. There's obviously costs that come with a building of that age. It's a flat roof, so we know that there's going to be roof issues, things of that nature, but we're confident that that structure itself is sound and there is potential redevelopment opportunity with the building itself. But that is something I think after these first 90 days, if we have a feeling or an idea that maybe the building itself would be a hindrance to redevelopment of that actual property, then I think we would get in serious discussions with the community, the commission, the land bank about moving forward with demolishing it and looking at putting a new construction redevelopment opportunity out there. But I think we have an asset in the building that can be reutilized and can be turned into a great redevelopment opportunity for that corridor and for the community as a whole.
Thank you.
I was at a rally last Saturday, and this came up, and I told them at the time that the city was certainly still working hard to get someone in there, and that's the case, and we hope it turns out well. So as someone who was a customer of that grocery store, I would love to buy my groceries there from whoever wants to locate there. Anybody else? Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton,
Yes,
Mr. Rue,
Yes.
Dr. Estrop,
Yes,
Mr. Copeland.
Yes. And I should have also said, I think we're grateful to the land bank to be willing to be involved in this process. Okay, clerk, proceed.
The next ordinance was amended after the agenda was published, so there is one reference number within the ordinance that was changed. That was on the add-on sheet. Authorizing the city manager to apply for and accept, if awarded, Federal CARES Act funding distributed through the County Coronavirus Relief Distribution Fund and declaring an emergency therein.
so
Move
moved.
to adopt.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or comments from the commission?
Yes, what can this money be used for?
Yes, so this is money that was sent down from the federal level down to state and local governments. Local governments of 500,000 or more in population, both at the county and city level, receive direct distribution from the federal government. And then the states were allocated the remaining money to push down to communities below 500,000. What the state of Ohio has done here is they've allotted the initial 350 million of 1.2 billion through House Bill 481 to provide relief related relative to COVID-19 related expenses. So expenses that were incurred directly in relation to COVID-19 and the pandemic are eligible for reimbursement as this grant goes back to expenses expended after March 1 of 2020 and all the way through December 30th of 2020. And so we will be able to reimburse ourselves again for any directly related expenses relative to COVID-19. It's pretty strict guidance. The U.S. Treasury has put out guidance to follow. I actually have a meeting with Mark and Paul and Chris Moore after this meeting to start discussing what that looks like on our level. And we will be working towards what we can seek reimbursement on from these first 3 months, and then what we will assume will be eligible moving forward in 2020. We're going to receive an allotment a little bit over $2 million. We're not sure how much we'll be able to maximize of that $2 million, but we're going to work through the U.S. Treasury guidance and try to maximize as much funding to our organization as possible. The state does have $850 million that they've left set aside that can be allotted to local governments down the road. What they're hoping is that the federal government would relieve the restrictions on the money and allow local governments to utilize this for some form of revenue replacement. So they held back $850 million in the hopes that the federal government would do that. Congressman Warren Davidson in our district actually has proposed a bill at the federal level that would release or relieve some of the restrictions on that funding that came through the CARES Act. That legislation has not moved yet, but we're hopeful that it will get through committee and get through both the House and the Senate very quickly, and then the state could work to allocate the remaining money down to the local level.
Thank you.
So I'm happy to say I am now a member of a group of mayors of the 30 largest cities. The only city that hasn't joined is Columbus. But in any event, this money was sort of stuck in the Senate for a while, state Senate for a while. And one of our former Wittenberg students, who I actually had in class, who's the staff person for the mayor's group, was one of those who worked really hard to get it moved on. And the House acted very, very quickly once it came to them. So it may be one of those cases where actually doing a little lobbying worked. But so I did communicate on your behalf that we would use the money well.
Well, we appreciate that, and again, encourage, and I know the mayor's group has already been pushing at the federal level, as has the state and the managers group that I'm involved with, that they would relieve the restrictions on the remaining $850 million so that local governments can further maximize these dollars into our organizations and into our communities.
And I think both of our state senators have already committed to supporting that.
Yep.
So hopefully we'll get some more help. Anybody else? Clerk will call the roll.
Dr. Estra,
Yes.
Mr. Rue,
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton,
Yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes.
Authorizing the city manager to enter into amendment number 2 to the home ownership or rental housing loan agreement, 800 Clifton Avenue, 2018, with Neighborhood Housing Partnership of Greater Springfield Incorporated, and in declaring an emergency therein.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or comments from the commission? Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Mr. Rue,
Yes.
Dr. Estra,
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton,
Yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes.
Authorizing the city manager to enter into a subrecipient funding agreement with SBDC Incorporated to provide administrative funds in an amount not to exceed $90,000 to further the development of small businesses in the city for the period of July 1, 2020 through June 30th, 2021, and declaring an emergency therein.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or comments from the commission? Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton,
Yes.
Dr. Estra,
Yes.
Mr. Rue,
Yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes.
Authorizing the city manager to enter into an access agreement 2020 #1 with Cascade Corporation, granting access to city right-of-way to permit the installation of a monitoring well and piezometers in front of several properties and declaring an emergency therein.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions, comments from the commission? I express our appreciation for them, Cascade, being willing to continue to keep monitoring this. Thus far, problems have not shown up, but it is an ongoing concern. So of what part of what they do is somehow getting in under the underground water. So clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Chilton,
Yes.
Dr. Estra,
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Mr. Rue,
Yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes.
Confirming and approving change order #1 to the contract between the city and J&J Schlegel Incorporated for the CLA Belmont Avenue Reconstruction Phase 2 project, PID number 94814, rebid, to increase the contract in an amount not to exceed $26,612 for a total amount not to exceed $2,637,781.37, and authorizing the city manager to execute said change order #1 and declaring an emergency therein.
Move to
Move to
adopt.
adopt.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or comments from the commission? From the audience? Clerk will call the roll.
Dr. Estra,
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton,
Yes.
Mr. Rue, okay, Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes. I keep trying to
Amending-
get the audience involved, but they just won't join us, so.
Amending ordinance number 2066 to authorize the relocation of the underground electric communication cables at the water treatment plant from Triac Electrical Services Incorporated for an amount not to exceed $74,660 through the Ohio Department of Administrative Services pursuant to Ohio's Cooperative Purchasing Act in accordance with the provisions of Section 125.04 of the Ohio Revised Code and declaring it an emergency therein.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or comments from the commission? Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Rue,
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Dr. Estra,
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton,
Yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes.
The next item has been added to the agenda, appointing Bruce Sigmund to the Civil Service Commission and declaring it an emergency therein.
Move to
Move to
adopt.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or comments from the commission? I appreciate Bruce's willingness to serve. Anyone else? Clerk will call the roll.
Dr. Estrop,
Yes.
Mr. Rue,
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton,
Yes.
I'm sorry, I've already got him. Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes. That concludes our agenda. Are there other items that come before us from commissioners? Same three questions, Dave?
Same three questions, Mayor.
Okay.
Hey, Mark, wake up.
How are we doing in response to COVID-19 in terms of city services? How are we doing financially? And what are we looking like in the future? Same three questions.
Yeah, so I'll start with the first one as it relates to our organization and the impact of COVID-19. As of last week, really last Saturday or 2 Saturdays ago, we had our 4 officers that were on quarantine come off. They were all tested. They all tested negative. So they are back in full rotation. And we currently do not have anybody on quarantine at this point in time, which again is just a blessing and very positive that we staffing during this time. We are still in the incremental phases of reopening. We actually expanded our hours to the public this week. So starting yesterday, we expanded our first floor operation hours for utility billing and income tax from 8:30 to 12:30 on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and 1 to 5 on Tuesday and Thursday. Part of that was we were getting some long lines that were building up at the first floor, waiting to get in, which was really defeating the purpose of trying to protect and ensure the health of both our employees and our citizens. And so we felt expanding the hours was appropriate this time. We'll continue to operate in that mode with the 4 hours each day for a period of time to observe and see how things are going. As far as the rest of the organization is concerned, we're police and fire have been at basically normal operation throughout, but with the extended use of PPE, the personal protective equipment, and continuing to work with dispatch on specific calls that they're going on that they may encounter specific individuals that are either positive for COVID or are a likelihood of COVID. They may have been tested and not received results yet. So we have that data and we're sharing that with our first responders so that they can put the appropriate protocols in place to protect themselves and be safe. The other departments in the city, the service department is basically back to normal operations. Some of the admin staff continues to work remotely, but all of the labor staff continues to report directly to the building and usually go straight out from the building to the job site as opposed to going into the building. So we're trying to protect and keep social distance for those individuals as well. But we've continued to be able to provide the same level of service. So if you call with a complaint of a pothole or something, our service crews are doing a tremendous job of getting out there in the same amount of time that it would have taken them previously. So that continues to operate as normal. Other departments are starting to return to the office more in a full capacity. I'll joke around. Jill Pierce said one of her office returned fully to the office starting this past week. So, but the city manager's office has returned fully to the building this week. Community development continues to be on the rotating schedule. Finance plans to be fully in the building starting next week. And then I know the other departments are kind of following suit from there. Personnel continues to be in the building most of the time, and legal comes as well to the building. But we'll probably in the next couple weeks, we'll see that transition to where everybody's back to normal operations in the building. Obviously, we're going to continue to monitor the situation for the future. We hope after July 1, we're able to open things up a little bit more even. We're going to return to in-person meetings in July. So give you about a month's heads up. We do plan on the July 14th commission meeting to be in the forum at 7 p.m. So we won't be doing the Zoom meetings at that time unless something drastically changes in the numbers and we feel it's not safe to do that. But right now the plan is to go back to in-person meetings. That goes for other boards of the commission as well, City Planning Board, Board of Zoning Appeals, Historic Landmarks, all of the boards that you appoint. We look to return to live meetings starting in the month of July. And so those are the things that we're looking at doing here in the near future, but we continue to provide the same level of service. It may just be in a little bit different form to our residents and to our businesses. And so, again, I just thank our staff for continuing to adapt and adjust to the challenges that we're faced with during this pandemic. They're doing a phenomenal job, and they're just exceptional at the adaptations that they've made to be able to continue to provide services at a high level to our community.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions of Brian about that?
Not about that, but I did have a question for our police chief if he's available.
He is. I'm going to have Mark real quick answer on the finance question that Dave had. And then I'll call Lee up and have Lee answer the questions that you have as well.
Thank you.
Sure, I'd be happy to, commissioners, I'd be happy to report on our finances. I think we have done remarkably well through this period of the pandemic. I monitor our unencumbered cash very carefully, and in our 4 major funds, and what I consider the 4 that I look at carefully to be the general fund, obviously, the street fund, water, and sewer. Our cash balances are holding steady. In fact, they are better than they were as of March 15th. Our income tax revenues, I think I reported the last time, were down about 8%. We have continued to, the phrase I used before was manage with the resources available to us. And what that has included was cutting back on spending. Not so much on the personnel side, but project side, and just being careful with the spending that we do. As we start to, as an organization, ramp back up a little bit, I expect those balances to decrease. We have put a lot of things on hold, but we will be moving forward in a lot of different areas and probably spending some money, and that includes hiring some for vacancies that we have, and in particular some at the service center and the water treatment plant and the wastewater treatment plant. So I expect it to not be quite the same story when we get to August, but so far we've weathered this first part of the pandemic pretty well. As I mentioned it previously, our revenues will lag economic activity. So the fact that there was a slowdown in May may not show up in our revenues until as late as July. So all in all, I'm happy with where we have gone and how we've performed during this period of time, but we're certainly not out of the woods yet.
How much are we down income tax, did you say, percentage-wise?
8% roughly.
Okay.
Actually, that's very good. I was involved in a meeting of some city folks yesterday from across the state, and most were talking double digits, 15 or higher. So that is very good news, Mark. That it's only 8% at this point. I want to commend you and you, Brian, also for keeping an eye on our financial bottom line. And I certainly want to commend our employees who continue to do extraordinary work in these extraordinary times that we are living in, working, and playing in right now. They're doing a great job, and please express our appreciation to all of the city's staff.
We'll be happy to do so.
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else about finances? Okay, Joyce, you had a question about something else.
Right. I had a question for our police chief, Graff. I had hoped to see that the crime rate had gone down, and I was looking at comparison between March 14th, 2019 and May the 18th, 2019 compared to that same time in 2020. So I just want our police chief to speak on that, about the different mechanisms we have in crime.
Yes, and thank you, Commissioner, and good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. Basically, some things we've seen have been exactly what we kind of thought was predictable. In other words, call load is actually down. The number of calls we're actually receiving for service, when you look at from the beginning of the year to now, or the end of May, to last year is down 16%. And more significantly, during the kind of closing of the state and our area for COVID from March to May is down 19%. However, on the crime stats, which Commissioner you were referring to, those are up. Overall, when we compare January through May to last year, they're up approximately about 5%. And just for everybody at home as they watch this, please understand that when we talk about stats and we throw numbers around, I'm very aware, and I know the commission is very cognizant as well. We're talking about a victim. Behind every one of these stats, there's a victim. So when we throw numbers around, understand that we realize the weight of that. So it always sounds so frivolous when we throw numbers, but I realize that, and it's unacceptable. We don't want it. But we're looking at about a 4.8% increase. Violent crime is up about 12%. To kind of put that in relation, we're talking about 12 more incidents versus last year. And property crime is up 4%. I think a lot of this, Commissioner, has to do obviously with COVID. Just like what Mark was talking about and how it impacts the economy, this is obviously going to have an impact on the sociology of crime and the science of kind of looking at that. For instance, it would be pretty predictable for me to say I'll bet burglaries would be down. They are down. They're down 15% because more people were at home, so there was less opportunity. However, crimes like motor vehicle crime and theft is up dramatically. It's up 64%. Now, what I would say in that as well, though, is for folks at home, when we do these statistics, things like trailers, four-wheelers, dirt bikes that aren't normally considered licensed vehicles by state definition are motor vehicles. And because a lot of people aren't able to work because of COVID and staying home, a lot of those trailers and things like that, things that we can't take to the parks out in the state and all that, are sitting at home. And criminals adapt just like we adapt to the circumstances. And so we're kind of seeing an uptick in that area as well. I would say that 5% is too much for an increase. I would try to keep it a little bit in perspective. Like everything else we've seen over the last several years, violent crime and property crime is decreasing in our numbers in Springfield every year. If you compare it to, say, the 5-year average, we're actually down at this point about 14%. But we are spiking a little bit compared to what we saw last year. That's kind of an overview. Commissioner, I'd be happy to answer any specific questions you might have.
Okay, I just want our citizens mostly to see that, doing a good job as far as protecting things, but citizens have to, like you said, help yourselves. Your home, or those trailers and motorbikes and all that stuff are sitting out. So let's just be aware of what's going on with the COVID-19. Those were my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Chief Dave Estrup, are those numbers similar to what other communities, particularly our size or larger, are they experiencing similar increases, or is this rather unique to Springfield?
Doctor, I would say, and this is kind of anecdotal without doing any kind of formal survey, but just in talking to some of the chiefs, because of COVID, we've actually been talking a lot about what are you doing in your city and what are we doing for each other to help each other out. I would say they're similar for cities our size. Same thing with the call load being down a little bit because people just aren't out as much. If you can imagine, if you take all the bar calls out, just in general, you're going to have a decrease. So yes, I think they're similar.
Yeah, I guess I would have expected that, but I hope the discussions that you're having with the other police chiefs across the state are bearing some fruit in terms of learning from each other. I know that's a great way to solve problems.
Yes, doctor, I would say they are. I mean, not only with COVID and obviously some of the situations we've been dealing with and talking about at length over the last several weeks. There's a lot of lessons learned here, and there's also a lot of very positive opportunities, especially for our community, I think, to kind of make some strides, improve our department, make advances. So yes, sir. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chief.
So Chief, you had some work done on you, right?
Yes, Mayor. I think they were asking me to turn my video on, but I don't think, first of all, anybody wants to see my basement, and they sure don't want to see me in my t-shirt with a sling on. But I had some surgery on my shoulder on Friday. Everything went very, very well. I anticipate being back at it in full strength, hopefully by next Monday. I'll be faking it a little bit, but I'll be okay and ready to be back in the office. Thanks for asking.
So you're
Glad you're well.
all right about the surgery?
What's that?
You're feeling all right about the surgery, though?
Yeah, they essentially they went in and they took some things out and didn't put anything in. So that means my recovery time will be faster than it might normally be. But yes, I think everything went really well.
Good. Anything else from commissioners? Okay, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second,
Been moved and seconded. Any discussion? Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Rue,
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Dr. Estrop,
Yes.
Mrs. Chilton,
yes.
Mr. Copeland.
Yes. Meeting is adjourned.